Changing a country isn't easy, but change is inevitable, and the choices we make today will shape our country for generations to come. That's why we've published our first book from Australia Institute Press. What's the Big Idea offers 32 ideas for a better Australia, from leading thinkers such as Bob Brown, Sally McManus, Dr. Emma Shortis, and Professor Brian Schmidt. The essays are a roadmap and a reminder that the solutions exist. Australia just needs the courage to implement them. Visit australiainstitute.org.au or follow the link in the show notes to order your copy of What's the Big Idea today.
After America is made on the lands of the Kure-Wurrung, Ngunnawal and Ngambri peoples, we acknowledge that they and their ancestors have cared for the lands, rivers and sea, and all living creatures for thousands of generations. We pay our respects to elders past and present and acknowledge that sovereignty was never ceded.
We are in a battle for the soul of America.
This is a fraud on the American public.
And we're back. Welcome to After America. I'm Alice Grundy, Managing Editor at the Australia Institute Press, and welcome to our first episode for 2025. In preparation for Trump, Project 2025 described a world on fire. Not wrong. California is enduring some of the worst wildfires in American history in the middle of winter.
November, December, now January. There's no fire season, it's fire year, it's year-round.
In all, at least 24 people have died, more than 24 people are still missing, and more than 40,000 acres have burned.
Trump, meanwhile, is thinking about empire building, literally.
Economic force, because Canada and the United States, that would really be something. And I said that to, as I called him, Governor Trudeau. I said, listen, what would happen if we didn't subsidize you, if we didn't, because we give them a lot of money. The Panama Canal is vital to our country. It's being operated by China. China.
And you didn't rule out military coercion.
Well, we need Greenland for national security purposes. I've been told that for a long time, long before I even ran. I mean, people have been talking about it for a long time.
He's talked about annexing Greenland, reclaiming the Panama Canal, and making Canada the 51st American state. And his far right-hand man, Elon Musk, has been using his platform to plug anti-immigration parties in the United Kingdom and Germany, even calling for a change of leadership in the UK's Reform Party. And Trump isn't even president until next week. So here to talk about this is the inimitable Dr. Emma Shortis, Director of International and Security Affairs at the Australia Institute. Welcome, Emma.
Hey, Alice. Nice to see you.
You too. So taking control of Greenland, the Panama Canal and Canada were not part of Trump's election campaign, which focused on borders, oil and tax. When did this shift happen?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know about you, but I don't remember any of this coming up in the election campaign, even though it was a very long couple of months. This isn't entirely new for Trump. So he talked about Greenland in his first administration. Some listeners might remember, but he spoke about it then as more of a kind of real estate deal or proposition. The way he's speaking about it now is quite new. He's even gone so far when he was asked a question in a press conference to not rule out using force to annex Greenland and potentially Panama for the United States.
Can you assure the world that as you try to get control of these areas, you are not going to use military or economic coercion?
No.
What is the strategy?
Yeah. I can't assure you, you're talking about Panama and Greenland. No, I can't assure you on either of those two. But I can say this, we need them for economic security.
So it is quite a shift from the election campaign, but in a way it's, I think, not really a surprising one for a number of reasons. The United States, of course, has a really long history of being an empire or being empire-like. There are long and sometimes kind of ridiculous scholarly debates about when the United States became an empire and whether it still is. Trump, as he usually does, is kind of highlighting that history and kind of pointing out how easy it is for Americans to forget that history, even though they're kind of in the middle of quickly reviving it. I think potentially, you know, as much as what Trump is doing fits into that longer history of imperialism and particularly white imperialism, he's also doing what Trump does best, which is obscuring other things, you know, drawing everybody's attention to something outrageous that he's doing or saying in order to avoid scrutiny on other things. And I think in this case, it's particularly that all of his kind of flagship promises, you know, Alice, you mentioned borders, you mentioned oil drilling, you mentioned tax reform, are things that are actually really difficult to do. And they're really difficult to do with a Congress that has razor-thin margins and certain members of Trump's own party, the Republican Party, that are pretty prone to acting out and demanding things even of Trump. And so I think that this is his way of kind of projecting power and masculinity and empire while obscuring the kind of more complicated business of actually getting what he wants to get done in an effective way. And so far, it seems to be working.
Mm. And for listeners interested in America's history of imperialism, the Empire series with William Dalrymple and Anita Anand has a few really good episodes on that. So what you're saying here, this sounds as though you're really talking about an undermining of Trump's anti-war isolationist identity. Is that right?
Yeah, big time. I think, you know, we've spoken, Alice, about this idea of Trump being an isolationist and being anti-war before on the podcast because, you know, he's been so effective at kind of deploying this line that he is anti-war, you know, that his administration was the first since Jimmy Carter's to have not actually started a war, which, you know, like pretty much everything Trump says is if not a lie, a distortion, I suppose, of the truth. But this kind of highlights, I think, you know, this idea of not ruling out force to conquer a sovereign nation, a couple of sovereign nations for the United States, kind of highlights that, you know, Trump isn't anti-war. He's just anti kind of specific types of war. In fact, his vision for the United States in the world is quite a violent and conquering one. You know, he has this really aggressive vision of American power, and none of that is really isolationist. You know, I think people kind of tend to see him quite understandably as isolationist because, you know, he threatens to withdraw from organizations like NATO, from multilateral organizations like even, you know, the World Health Organization. And that, of course, is a form of isolationism, but it doesn't mean that the United States will withdraw from the world under Trump. It just means that it will stomp all over it in kind of a different way. It's surprising to me that it's happening so quickly, that he's highlighting that so quickly, you know, before he's even inaugurated. But, you know, he does like to surprise us like that.
Mm. And when you talk about changes to his stated aims before he's even been inaugurated, one of them is the changing commentary that he's had on Ukraine, for example, that he had said, on day one, we'll end the war. And now it looks as though it's going to be 100 days. So do you think in terms of the election promises, we're going to see a lot more of this winding back?
Yeah, look, I think so. I think that was always going to happen on Ukraine because any effort to end that war on day one would require effectively just unacceptable concessions on the part of the Ukrainians and Europeans more broadly to Russia. You know, that was just never going to fly in Europe in particular. And I think Trump and people around him were aware of that. That was just an effective line that they were deploying. So I think we will see that happen on multiple fronts where the realities of governing clash with the, you know, radical kind of outrageous promises that Trump has made. So I think we will see that kind of pantomime and his reflexive need for kind of symbolic victories, you know, the need to talk about conquering Greenland as opposed to the kind of difficult business of enacting immigration reform, as horrifying as his ideas for that are. But that doesn't mean we won't see really quick, really aggressive efforts to implement that agenda nonetheless. You know, he'll have a suite of he does have a suite of executive orders waiting for him to sign kind of as soon as he's inaugurated, as soon as he walks into the White House, many of which will be about immigration or about oil drilling, for example. And there are plans already underway in Congress to create what they would describe as an omnibus bill, so a kind of enormous bill that covers all of Trump's agenda around immigration and oil and tax reform in particular, and kind of ramming that through Congress as quickly as possible. There is this sense, I think, and again, we've talked about this before, about learning the lessons of the first Trump administration and not kind of falling into the chaos of the first couple of days of the first go round with things like the Muslim ban. I think there's a strong chance that will happen again, but Trump and the people around him are very conscious of how badly that went for them, and I think are creating strategies to avoid a direct repeat of that scenario.
Mm. And you mentioned the comment that Trump was the first president to not start a war since Jimmy Carter, the 39th US president, passed away over the break. Emma, I know you're a big Carter stan, but his legacy stands in stark contrast to the kind of empire building that we're already seeing from the Trump administration, and indeed Carter's approach to and consideration of climate change, notably the first president to put solar panels on the White House.
Yep.
What has his passing been bringing to the fore in the media and in the commentary around the current status quo?
Look, I think that some of the media coverage, Alice, was really visibly torn about how to deal with Jimmy Carter, particularly because there were several living presidents in attendance at his funeral. Joe Biden gave the eulogy. That there was this attempt to kind of deploy this idea that this was a rare moment of unity for American politics, that Donald Trump and Barack Obama are sitting next to each other and having a little bit of a laugh about something in this kind of really Twilight Zone scene. But it wasn't that, it could never be that because, of course, exactly as you described, Alice, Carter could not be more of a contrast to Donald Trump. And Joe Biden, in his eulogy, highlighted that pretty directly without actually naming Trump.
We have an obligation to give hate no safe harbor and to stand up to what my dad used to say is the greatest sin of all, the abuse of power. That's not about being perfect, because none of us are perfect. We're all fallible. But it's about asking ourselves, are we striving to do things, the right things? Do we operate from fear or hope, ego or generosity? Do we show grace? Do we keep the faith when it's most tested? For keeping the faith.
He talked about the abuse of power. He talked about humility and Carter's legacy. So there has been this really kind of mixed reaction, I think, to Carter. And Carter's always been a bit of an enigma in American history anyway. I think American, particularly kind of standard American liberal analysis doesn't really know what to do with Carter because some of his policies were so genuinely progressive in the kind of global sense of progressive and not the American sense. And in that sense, his legacy is really challenging to many Democrats. And it's particularly challenging, I think, more recently because Carter was so outspoken about Palestine and had been for a really long time. So he in his kind of very gentle, very humble way, really challenged the kind of orthodoxies of the American Democratic Party as well, much of which, of course, was kind of swept under the rug at the funeral in particular. But I think that the symbolism of Carter's death and his funeral at this time, 10, 11 days or whatever out from the inauguration of Donald Trump is kind of, it's almost too easy, it feels a bit cheap to use it. But it is pretty striking. And look, I think the only other thing I'd say about Carter is that, his 4 years in office also really demonstrate that being president is hard. Changing the trajectory of American history, of the United States' role in the world is really, really difficult. Carter found it almost impossible to enact his human rights agenda beyond some signature achievements around Camp David in the Middle East, for example. But those kind of big, overwhelming structural factors of American politics and American bureaucracy, America's role in the world, for Carter really kind of clashed with his own approach to the presidency, which was deeply flawed as well. He was famously a micromanager. In the first sort of part of his administration, he was famous for like managing the tennis court bookings at the White House. He made some pretty significant mistakes when he was president. And so he kind of brings together, I think, all of these, structural and individual factors around the presidency to show how difficult it is to do that job well, even when you're committed to doing that job well and committed to trying to make Americans, and people outside of America's lives better. And again, the contrast with Trump, but the way that those structural factors will also affect the Trump presidency, that's been a really interesting and maybe kind of unexpected intro, I suppose, into the second Trump era.
Mm. And in this second Trump era, thinking about America and its place in the world, one of Trump's first executive orders, like last time, will be to withdraw from the Paris Agreement. And this is happening as California is enduring these incredibly horrific wildfires, some of the worst in American history, and they're happening in winter.
Wildfires are a fact of life here, but nothing prepared people for destruction on this scale.
Firefighters in Los Angeles are warning that increasing winds could potentially result in explosive fire growth from the existing wildfires.
And as the ATF investigates how these wildfires even started, residents are scrambling to find a place to live, all those families that were displaced.
California Governor Gavin Newsom responded to another onslaught of criticism from President-elect Donald Trump and his allies as they blamed Democrats' handling of the wildfires, slamming the government as incompetent on Sunday.
Multiple times, Mr. Trump has threatened to withhold aid for California wildfires, both as president and now again as president-elect. You worried that he might actually do that?
Well, I mean, he's done it to Utah, he's done it to Michigan, did it to Puerto Rico. He did it to California back before I was even governor in 2018, until he found out folks in Orange County voted for him, and then he decided to give the money.
Can we talk a bit about what's happening in California and how this is possible?
Yeah, it is really horrifying, Alice, I think, viewed particularly from Australia, where we have this kind of quite intimate connection in our experience of bushfire and wildfire. The fires in California, depending on how you measure these things, could become some of the worst in American history. The governor of California, Gavin Newsom, has said that it could be the worst in American history in terms of the cost. That's not necessarily the best way to measure these things, but he thinks that the eventual cost of the destruction caused by these fires could surpass Hurricane Katrina, which was the largest in American history, potentially until now, and that involved $200 billion worth of damage. And of course, the fires are still ongoing. There are appalling wind conditions now developing kind of as we're recording again. And just in the last hour, as I was kind of checking, prepping for this recording, the death toll has risen to 24 people. And, the governor and people in charge are kind of foregrounding that is likely to increase quite significantly. So it's really, really quite frightening. And of course, it's fueled, it should, I suppose, go without saying that it's fueled by climate change, that climate change is absolutely making these fire conditions worse. And climate scientists just kind of describe what's happening in California and elsewhere. Of course, it's not limited to California as hydroclimate whiplash. So extreme wet periods then kind of followed up immediately by extreme dry periods, which increase the fuel load and make fires burn hotter and longer, and then they're fueled, of course, by the Santa Ana winds in California. So there's this kind of recipe really for disaster in California that everybody knew was coming. But the fact that it's come now kind of almost at the start of the Trump administration, when Trump is saying he's going to withdraw from the Paris Agreement, and he will do that immediately because that's a really easy, again, going back to what we were talking about before, highly symbolic thing for him to do. And, he's busy picking fights with the governor of California and, Democrat Greenie management of land, which, again, we're very familiar with here in Australia. There's this kind of exchange in those right-wing narratives between our two countries. So it is, it's deeply frightening, and you can see kind of in real time how the climate crisis compounds the crisis in American politics and kind of fuels the re-rise and the dominance of right-wing narratives where there's that kind of like really classic fascist strategy of blaming the outgroup, blaming Democrats, blaming environmentalists, blaming whoever for what is happening rather than looking at the actual structural clear reasons for these fires. So unfortunately, it's kind of playing right into Trump's playbook, I suppose.
Mm. And so far in Australia, we've been lucky that we haven't had a lot of bushfires this summer. But in another year, we've regularly borrowed, American and Canadian water bombers. And so the consequences aren't just for America, they're also for other countries. Can you talk a bit about responses from the Biden administration and from the Californian state government as well?
Yeah, sure. So Biden has actually been really quick to respond. The Biden administration, to its credit, has had to respond to quite a number of disasters like this and has done so quite quickly with releasing funds more to the Federal Emergency Management Authority and to people affected by the fires. One of the things that stood out to me, I think, is that the Biden administration has made the Department of Defense available to California in its response, so supplying equipment and personnel. The California National Guard has also been deployed and are providing, support and equipment as well. So you can see, again, this kind of, I guess, connection between the national security state and responses to climate change, alongside a refusal still to see climate change as a security issue. And again, that's not just isolated to the United States, that happens in Australia as well. But, one of the many conversations I guess we're not having is how those kinds of climate disasters will affect the defense relationship and our security relationship with the United States, because that exchange that you mentioned earlier, Alice, between the kind of firefighting authorities in Australia and the United States, Canada and Europe as well, is deeply affected by the fact that, as the governor of California, Gavin Newsom, has said, there aren't fire seasons anymore. It's just year round. And how could we expect American firefighters to come to Australia in our fire season when they're fighting fires in the middle of winter in California? And again, I don't think, the budgetary or the equipment considerations are really being, I guess, dealt with in a way that is kind of anticipating what is going to continue to happen and continue to get worse if we continue to not do anything about it.
It's a good connection you make between defense and climate. In the press conference that he had the other day, Trump was talking about wanting NATO signatories to increase their defense spending to maybe 5% of GDP, which would obviously have impacts on the kinds of spending that these countries could do on environmental issues. Seems completely unconcerned about the fact that these are going to be competing issues. And a big part of Trump's pitch during the campaign was for more drilling.
I will end Kamala's war on American energy, and we will drill, baby, drill. We're going to drill, baby, drill. And I'll terminate her Green New scam, one of the greatest scams in the history of our country, devised by a person who never even took an environmental course. You know who that is, right? AOC +3.
So it seems as though these wildfires and their causes being clearly from climate change, that's not going to have an impact on Trump environmental policy.
No, I don't imagine so, and I think it's one of the many kind of horrifying things about all of this is Trump's response, which, quite clearly sees what is happening in California as something that's happening to a Democratic stronghold. He sees it as an opportunity to attack a Democratic governor and as a political opportunity, not as something that's going to continue to affect Americans everywhere and affect them in more extreme ways, and also affect them in the places where he has the most support. But, he's so effective at redirecting blame, to the outgroups that it sort of doesn't matter to him. And, I think there's also this perception amongst Trump and the kind of rich oligarchs or whatever we want to call them around him that, this won't affect them, which, I guess, like, lots of people have kind of been wondering aloud when, if ever, those people will realize that climate change is coming to them too. There's been so much attention paid to the celebrities in Los Angeles who have lost their houses, and how kind of resources have been deployed to protect kind of rich neighborhoods over potentially poorer ones, a lot of which is of course kind of driven by social media, but is also just part of the reality of economic life in the United States. So that people are kind of openly questioning like when that realization is going to dawn, but I don't think it necessarily will, because it's also true that Trump and Elon Musk and those people can insulate themselves from the worst effects of climate change. And Trump doesn't care about the rest of the world. We've already talked about that. He doesn't care about how climate change affects the Pacific or, even stability in the Pacific. He just sees it as a staging ground for great power competition with China. So no, I don't, of course, Trump's not going to act on any of that. And one of the promises, as you mentioned, Alice, one of the promises he made was about oil drilling. And that's a relatively easy thing for him and his administration to do, to rescind Biden's, even his recent orders banning oil drilling in certain areas. He can do that fairly quickly, mostly through executive orders, and he will, because again, it's kind of highly symbolic. It's an easy political win for him. He can kind of integrate it into his culture wars. So that part of the Trump administration's agenda, I think, at least is, pretty predictable.
And do you see, I mean, as you mentioned, California is predominantly Democrat. Do you see greater separation between states that are Democrat and their action on climate change under a Trump administration? Will that be an option for them?
Look, I mean, I think so. In as much as that is possible, that's certainly something that happened the first time around in the Trump administration. California in particular enacted a whole bunch of climate initiatives and legislation and agreements as well, even international agreements around climate action, and kind of alongside a number of other Democratic states and even cities kind of saw themselves as stepping into the breach where Trump was kind of withdrawing from global leadership. So I think there's certainly potential for that to happen again. But of course, Trump is a vengeful man. He's already been kind of talking about withholding federal funding from California because of his, like what the media describes as his beef with Gavin Newsom. And he will do that again. There's no doubt that he will attack those kind of, again, quote unquote, Democrat cities as much as he can. But in areas like climate, but also in reproductive rights, many states will, I think, defy Trump as much as they can, as much as they're able to within the constraints of the American political system. Yeah.
And then at a global level, if the US, or when the US pulls out of the Paris Agreement, is that the kind of activity that can spur other nations to greater action? Is it an excuse for inaction? How do you see it progressing?
Look, I think it can be both. There's often this kind of effort to really kind of dramatically mischaracterize the United States' role in global climate action when it comes to Trump, to say like, or no, to do all this hand-wringing because the United States is withdrawing from its global leadership role in climate action, as if the United States has not been a massive roadblock to genuine climate action throughout most of its history. And so there's a distortion of history and the present there that I think we really have to push back on, because countries like ours, countries like Australia, have been really good at hiding behind the United States' inaction as well. Australia's got a long history of kind of letting the United States water down and torpedo climate action, and then kind of following along as if we had no choice and it, wasn't actively in the government of the day's interest to do the same thing. We did that with the Kyoto Protocol in the 90s and have consistently hidden behind, bigger nations' refusal to act since then. But that's not inevitable. I think there is a huge, exactly as you highlighted, there is a huge opportunity for other nations to I guess, wash the hands of the United States in climate negotiations, in multilateral institutions, in climate action, and just kind of get on with it. I think that Europe in particular, there's lots of talk about Europe becoming the leader in climate action that didn't eventuate last time, but, hopefully could eventuate this time. Australia could play a huge role, particularly in our own region in the Pacific, in stepping up on climate action, in, not kind of contradicting ourselves constantly with promises around climate action and then turning around and opening a new coal mine or a new gas field here in Australia, which is what, the Australian government is doing at the moment. There's an opportunity, I think, to really kind of change the landscape around climate action globally, because the United States has so clearly or is so clearly going to remove itself. Taking that opportunity, of course, will require some pretty significant political bravery, but that doesn't mean it's not possible.
Well, Inauguration is all of a sudden upon us. It's just next week. Is this going to be the biggest crowd ever?
Surely, of course. It'll be even bigger than the first time around. No, look, I don't think so. I don't expect that it will be a huge crowd. I mean, for one thing, it's freezing in DC at the moment. DC can get incredibly cold, and Trump, at least kind of in recent times, just hasn't been mobilising the same kind of numbers as he has been. There will be a huge organisational effort, of course, to mobilise people to get them there. And it's worth saying as well that as of kind of the time of recording, Trump's inauguration committee or whatever has raised $170 million in donations, which is a pretty significant record-breaking achievement, I guess, if we want to call it that.
And what's that money for? Where does the $170 million go?
It's a really great question, Alice, and we don't really know the answer to that. So theoretically, it's for, the event itself, but because of weird electoral legal loopholes that I'm not going to pretend to understand, a lot of that money and how it's used kind of is, as far as I can tell, unaccounted for. And it is quite clearly a way for people to ingratiate themselves with Trump in particular. That's why you see all of the kind of big tech bros and tech companies donating huge amounts of money to Trump, where they just didn't do that with Joe Biden. Like the contrast in sums is pretty outstanding. So it's a great way for Trump to kind of do what he does best and engage in the grift. And again, he's done it pretty effectively this time around. So we don't know how it's being spent. Some of it might be spent on things like performers, but we still don't know who it's going to be. Trump, who's going to be, singing the national anthem and things like that. Trump historically has had a lot of trouble finding people to do that kind of stuff for him. So, yeah, we'll have to wait and see. But it's a huge affair. Even when I was in Washington for the election, you couldn't get through, most of that part of DC because they were already building the infrastructure for the event. It's a huge undertaking, and we know Trump relishes those kinds of moments.
Well, that's all we've got time for this week. Thanks so much, Emma, for your insight as always. This episode was recorded on Monday, 13 January. No doubt a bunch of stuff will have happened since then. And Emma, you'll be up in Canberra in about 4 weeks' time for the Australia Institute's Climate Integrity Summit. Tell us about it.
Yeah, that's right, Alice. I'm really looking forward to coming to Canberra. We are hosting the 2025 Climate Integrity Summit on Wednesday, the 12th of February at Parliament House in Canberra. I'll be speaking about some of the stuff we've covered today, Australia's relationship with the United States when it comes to climate action, alongside a pretty outstanding list of speakers, including humanitarian Craig Foster, Senator David Pocock, the G7 Plus General Secretary Dr. Helder da Costa, and Tiwi Islands campaigner Antonia Burke. So we'll be talking about how Australia's domestic and international integrity when it comes to climate action influences the international context, and how the 2025 federal election outcome here in Australia might shape global climate action. And it actually sells out really quickly every year. So if you're in Canberra or you might be in town on that day, you can get your ticket now via the link in the show notes or through the Australia Institute's website.
Make sure you get your tickets quick smart. You can find us on social media. We're at the Oz Institute, that's with an AUS, on Twitter and Instagram, and at australiainstitute.org.au on Blue Sky. You can reach out to us with feedback and episode ideas via our email address, that's podcast@australiainstitute.org.au. If you're enjoying After America, please tell your friends about the show. After America is supported by the Andrew Farron Foundation and produced by Angus Blackman. Our music is from Blue Dot Sessions. Emma will be back next week with a stellar guest for an inauguration special. I'm Alice Grundy. Thanks for listening.